stand by. A vast restructuring of the country's economy is needed if remedies are to become available to the average person. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today revolves around many subjects, but mainly two key areas. One is the restructuring of state-owned enterprises in the country, as well as domestic debt restructuring. Now, if you have invested your money in Treasury Bills over the last few months, will you be affected? Will the government take a haircut? If so, how it's going to affect you at home? So we'll discuss all this and more tonight on Face the Nation. Joining us this evening on the show are Dr. Anurag Ekanaika, former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Thank you very much, Dr. Ekanaika, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. Dr. Ekanaika has been very vocal on Face the Nation throughout the last few years to get the government to change its domestic policies with regard to its economy. All joining us for the first time on the show is Mr. Ranjit Fernando, former director and CEO of National Development Bank, and also former chairman of Sri Lankan Airlines. Thank you very much, Mr. Fernando, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. Also joining us tonight on the show is Professor Priyanka Durasinghe, University of Colombo, a senior lecturer, has been on the show many occasions and has voiced his opinions on the country's economy. Also joining us tonight on the show is Ravi Abesurya, Advocacy Chair, Director of the CFA Society in Sri Lanka. He was also involved with Sri Lanka Insurance for some time. Thank you very much, Ravi, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. Also joining us for the first time is Talal Rafi, economist and senior global management consultant at Deloitte. Thank you very much, Talal, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. To grill these gentlemen constructively as far as the show is concerned, we've invited two journalists today as well on the show. On to immediate right is Shania Dadigama. Shania, did I get your name right this time? And also Nadim Majid, our usual journalist, Farmer, joining us this evening on Face the Nation. So you could also direct your questions on 076 656 5353. The number once again, 076 656 5353. And we would be delighted to take your questions to the panelists with regard to the two subjects that we're talking about, restructuring of state-owned enterprises as well as domestic debt restructuring. To get the ball rolling, let's start off with Dr. Anurag Ekanaika, former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. What are your thoughts on the subject that we're discussing today, Dr. Ekanaika?
I mean, when we talk of debt restructuring or even SOE privatization, we need to understand the history, the trajectory of the economy, which brought us to the situation we experienced in March, April and so on last year, just a few months ago. You know, the queues, people dying on queues, all sorts of shortages, all of that. All that is because for 70 years we have had twin deficits. One is budget deficit, that is the government has been spending way more than what it was earning. And the other is trade deficit and balance of payment deficit, where our earnings from abroad, overseas, were just about half what we needed to import all what we need and also to settle debt. Now, we now talk of was it necessary to go to IMF, for example, and that all the remedies which have been spoken of, SOE reform, debt restructuring, as if they are thrust upon us by IMF. This has to be seen in a more objective, evidence-based manner. The fact that Sri Lanka was heading to a debt crisis was very evident way back, as far back as 2016-17. up to 2016 or 17, if I remember, annual debt service abroad, overseas debt service, was less than $2 billion. And by 2016-17, it was very clear that in the subsequent years, this was going to double and even triple. So, in the period after, from 2018 onwards, I think in 2018, the debt service abroad was about 3 billion, and the following years it went over 4, and by the time the crisis really hit us, it was over 6 billion. So this was something which was known by all those economists, the analysts, people like us who looked at these things. It was very clear. And action had to be taken. If those corrections were done, we had the choice. If those corrections were done, there was no need to go to IMF. But we went to IMF when our, what do you call, real available reserves had come down to way below $1 billion. Some say $400, $500 million.
And there was a time, there was
already pushed to a corner. There was no other choice, right, but go to IMF and ask for a facility.
There was a time, Dr. Ekanayaka, President Ranil Wickremesinghe said that he was much more richer than the government of Sri Lanka because he had $2,000 in his house. My question to you is...
let me complete this little bit because it's important to set the tone of all the deliberations tonight. So by then, whoever who would have been in power, there was no choice. There was only one place to go, and that was to IMF. Even the friendly nations, I won't name them, people who have countries which have been with us for a long time, they all said, start with IMF, we'll come to your help. Without exception. Okay, if at all the only exception was India, but India took a lead role in facilitating an IMF program to help us, right? So, no choice. And now look at the list of stuff or reforms IMF's program includes. And start asking, aren't they things we should have done ourselves without being forced to go to IMF? Corruption, deal with corruption. Do we have to have any body, institution outside to tell us that we must deal with corruption? Recover stolen assets. Aren't those things we should do ourselves? Have focused, targeted support programs for the needy? Isn't that something we should do? Right? And stop wasting scarce resources in utilized in inefficient businesses, badly managed businesses, so that we lose more and more money. Those are things we ought to do ourselves. The last one, of course, is debt restructuring. Debt restructuring simply because, as at today's count, total debt is about 128% of our GDP. And of that, almost half, 49% is foreign debt. And what's the kind of money we earn in the form of foreign exchange to be able to pay that? We can't. We simply don't have that kind of money. Take 7 billion, if you take 2022, say $6.5 billion had to be paid if we did not do this preemptive default, right? That was some 8%, between 8 to 10% of our GDP. That's money our people, poor people could have consumed. That's money the private sector and the government could have invested in this economy to grow. But all that had to be stopped and had to be sent out. It's simply not doable. So now, if we have to exist, if we are to at least manage our levels of consumption so that there won't be deprivation right across the board, there won't be starvation, we got to restructure the debt. Right? So I like to leave that as a kind of a base for our deliberations tonight.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Henri Kanayaka, former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. And now move attention to Mr. Ranjit Fernando, former director, CEO of National Development Bank, as well as the former chairman of the Sri Lankan Airlines entity, which has been continuously making losses in our resplendent island nation. Mr. Fernando, it's over to you.
Yeah. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I think we are at a point in the country where we're facing unprecedented crisis that the country has never faced before. We have been declared a bankrupt nation. So it's good to go back and see what really was the cause behind this. How did this come about? I think if you look at the post-independence era, all the 70-odd years we've spent after independence, we have been living beyond our means. Our expenditure in government has been far in excess of the income. And we have bridged that gap by taking loans. So we take a loan and bridge that gap. Next year again there is a gap because our income again is a fraction of the expenditure. If I give you some figures, in 2022, for instance, our government expenditure was 4.4 trillion, which was 18.9% of GDP. The income was 2 trillion, half the expenditure. So you bridge the gap by going and borrowing. Now, every year we have been doing that, and we have come to a point when we can't borrow more. What caused that? There were so many contributory factors that caused that. For instance, COVID and the failure of tourism income to come in as a result of that. Tax concessions that were given, unwanted tax concessions, no one asked for it, which amounted to 2% of GDP, and several other factors. For instance, the rating agencies, after the tax break was given, lowered the rating of Sri Lanka. And at that point, we couldn't borrow anymore. That's the point at which the crisis came on, because we couldn't bridge the gap between expenditure and by further borrowing. We couldn't borrow. Now, there's nothing wrong in borrowing, provided you invest that money meaningfully and there's a return so that you can service that debt. Now, we made another mistake. If you look at a businessman today who has a avenue to invest, he wants to expand his project, he goes to a bank. He has a choice of borrowing in foreign currency with an interest rate of about 4-5% and borrowing in rupees at 15. Now I'm talking of past year, now the interest rates are very high. But at that point, you had the opportunity of borrowing at 5% in US dollars and borrowing in local currency at 15-16%. Now, none of the businessmen took the foreign loan because he knows he has to pay back in foreign currency and pay back over 5-10 years. And when that happens, the exchange rate has moved against him and he has to buy dollars at a much higher rate than the point at which he took the loan. So that the effect of that is that it translates to a much higher rate than that 15%. So unless you are earning in foreign currency, taking a foreign currency loan is something that one shouldn't do, and no businessman does that. It's a simple logic. That is exactly what the government did. We borrowed in foreign currency, and what did we invest in? We invested in roads, the airport in Hambantota, all kinds of projects which did not earn foreign currency. So as a result of that, we find the crisis came on because we didn't have foreign currency to service the loans. Now a business can go to a bank and buy foreign currency. Where can a country buy foreign currency? No country will sell us foreign currency. We have to earn foreign currency by exports. So our exports were much less than the commitment we have in servicing loan. So that fundamental mistake of borrowing in foreign currency, investing in local currency earning projects, was a fundamental mistake that all the economists made in the government. So-called treasury people and all those people never looked at that. And we find today that we don't earn the foreign currency to service those loans. That was one major problem. And then we had to go to IMF because there is no one else who will lend us at this point. When we are in a bankrupt situation, we can't service our existing loans. No one is going to lend us further. We had to go to IMF. So there is no point in people blaming the IMF because it is not the IMF who came to us. It is we who went to IMF. And there was no alternative because they are the institution when there is a balance of payment problem in a country. They are the institution that is at hand to help us. And we went there. Now we are at the point. There are some people who say today that we have sorted out every problem, but now we have got the IMF loan. And they celebrate some like crackers, and they think it's the end of the problem. There are others who blame the IMF and blame the government to say that why did you go to IMF? We have sacrificed the nation by going to IMF and agreeing to conditionalities that affect the poor in a much further way than they are affected at present. So, but if you leave these two sides, views aside, IMF today has the only institution that has come to our help because the money is not the issue that the 2.9 billion or the 3 billion that they are given is not going to solve our problem. But it has given us respectability again that we are prepared to restructure our economy.
Right.
And we are in a position to have debt sustainability. We will change our economy, restructure our economy to get to the point where we can service those loans.
Right.
That confidence is what we are giving the world with the IMF participation.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Mr. Varane, we'll get back to you momentarily in the Q&A session. I want to give each speaker at least 4 minutes in the opening rounds to express their views on the subject tonight. I now move my attention to Professor Priyanka Dunusingha, representing the University of Colombo. Professor Dunusingha, let me ask you a very open-ended, direct question. Now, today we saw Ceylon Petroleum Corporation trade unions launching a protest against the privatization. How do you view this? The time starts now.
Basically, first, thank you for inviting the show. I think it is natural that we expect this type of protest, strike launched by the workers in state-owned enterprises when restructuring process is taken place, not in Sri Lanka but in any other country, because they know that in particular when it comes to privatization, then some of the privileges, benefits that they have enjoyed during the time that those entities were under government no longer can basically enjoy. I think that is the reality, no? So I think even the minister mentioned number of things where the trade unions enjoy number of benefits and other privileges, and even though the petroleum corporation make losses, okay, so they receive a bonus, the number of few vehicles allocated for the activities of the trade unions, and all those things were mentioned. So it is natural, but I think what we need to look at is that when it comes to state-owned enterprises, when it comes to restructuring, I think we need to basically look into the very purpose of their establishment. Why we have established state-owned enterprises. Generally, in economics, we could rationalize an SOE under three different objectives, so three different scenarios. One is due to market failures. We generally either it could be a monopoly, or that means you produce less but charge high. Another thing is a strategic objective. If you have a strategic objective that the country wants to pursue, the government may start a state-owned enterprises. Last one is we call the development objectives. So first thing that we need to look at by taking one by one, to which purpose that particular entity serve. For example, it is very clear Air Lanka or this the Lanka Hospital or the insurance, even the Hilton Hotel, we don't see that there is a market failure or there is a strategic objective that the government is aiming at pursuing, or even the development objective. So I mean, straight away one can say the privatization is the option. I mean, even though they make profit, we don't have, we have no reason to keep them with the state ownership. It is very clear. I mean, if we say those entities make profits, then government can even start a bakery tomorrow, because just because that business make profit. Okay, so but when it comes to the other some of the other SOE, state-owned enterprises, I think even the CEB, Ceylon Electricity Board, we need to, I think, we have to be careful, because some of the, now we know that even the very rural areas we have electricity. One can say, that is why the CEB has make losses, but we need to keep it in mind that serve for a particular development objective. So we need to be careful in some cases. If we straight away, if we recommend privatization in a blanket manner, sometimes some of those objective, very purposes why we have established some of these SOEs, I think we will not be able to achieve those objectives. So that is one thing that we need to keep it in mind. The second one is, even when you say privatization, per se may not say that the things will, the entities will run efficiently, productively, and overall enhancement with respect to the quality of services. Take the private bus operations here in Sri Lanka. Take the private schools. Take the private hospitals. Can we agree that they run in a very efficient manner and provide a very good quality service? Okay? In order to make sure, when you privatize, in order to make sure the expected outcomes we could achieve, we need to have relevant institutional setup. That is a requirement. Without such institutional setup, if we go and just privatize them, even though you can highlight number of things, new investments, improvement into the productivity, efficiency, and all these things, but none of those things could be achieved without a proper institutional mechanism that is in place.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Priyanka Dudusinghe, University of Colombo. Now I move my attention to Ravi Abesurya, Advocacy Chair and Director, CFA Society of Sri Lanka. Ravi, let me also pose a question to you because we can get some direction to the show tonight. So I saw in a recent article published by Bartlett Group, they say that domestic debt restructuring at least should be a 20% haircut, should be taken by those who have invested money as far as Treasury Bills and Treasury bonds are concerned. And then we saw economists who are very close to President Ranil Wickremesinghe saying that the haircut should be proportionately spread amongst all the groups in order to ensure that the impact of the haircut is not evidently seen. What is your opinion with regard to all this? Because we saw the IMF report also clearly pointing out that domestic debt restructuring has to happen without pressurizing the local banks. What is your take on this?
Yeah, see, where it is coming from is because our debt is not sustainable. So we need to include domestic debt in a restructuring situation, because restructuring only the external debt is not sufficient for debt sustainability. So we have to include domestic debt. Now the question that arises, who are the parties that will lead to, if we go ahead with the domestic restructuring, lead to some bigger damage than what we should in the restructuring itself, end up with a worst case situation. So now the biggest impact could be the banking system. We have other players like the central bank as well as the provident funds also having significant amount of the domestic debt. Now the biggest component is the banking, but if we go with the banking system as proposed, even if we go with a 20% across the board, that will have a serious impact in the banks, particularly state banks and the private banks, because they will have to be recapitalized. And I don't see how the shareholders, be the government first of all, for the domestic state banks, and the private sector shareholders be able to bring in that amount of share capital into the banks. At best they could do is about 5% if there is a domestic debt restructuring, whereas the central bank could take that hit. Now if you take the EEFF IMF document, it is very clearly mentioned taking into account the need to safeguard the domestic financial stability. And it goes on to say maintaining sound and adequate capitalized banking system as well as addressing the banking sector vulnerabilities is crucial to safeguard the financial stability. So we cannot afford to go into a situation where there is a banking crisis. Now when we have seen this happening in so many countries where there was a domestic debt restructuring, where the banking system went into a crisis. And that,
like even developed countries like the US,
yes,
we saw 2 banks collapsing in front of our own eyes. Will that happen in Sri Lanka?
I hope it will not, because the consequences are going to be much bigger than the crisis we had. So the cure is going to be worse than the medicine. So I would say the damage is going to be much worse. So we should at all costs, like former governor Indranith Kumarasamy has been maintaining continuously, we should avoid domestic restructuring which will affect the banking system. But other sectors may be able to absorb somewhat, like the public. We mentioned about treasury bills and treasury bonds held by the public and the central bank. Those two may be able to absorb some degree of haircut. But there are other methods of doing this, like reprofiling, where we don't need to do a kind of a haircut upfront on the capital, but issue new bonds and reprofile or extend the existing debt to be paid back in a longer period. But still there is an NPV impact when you do that.
Ravi, if you can explain to our viewers, when you say reprofiling of debt, what does it mean? Because the people have to know what this means, because those who have invested their money. Now you say the banking sector should not be able to absorb that haircut, but the public can. So the general public are watching the show tonight, so they would want to know, what do you mean by reprofiling?
Okay. Now what really happens is, you take a treasury bond which is say 2 years, and the government has to pay back that principal value by end of 2 years. In the meantime, you have to pay the coupon, the interest rate, every 6 months. So usually the later issues have been, coupon rates has been about 18, and latest has been even 20%. And the yield, the total return of some of the bonds that were issued maybe a month ago were about 30%. Why we paid 30% is because of the risk premium of a domestic debt restructuring or a haircut happening. So in my view, most investors will have invested knowing there is going to be a debt restructuring. That is why there was such a huge premium. Just imagine, you are getting 30% return You get double your money in, I think,
There was
3
a time
years.
it was going at 32% as well.
Exactly. So, and there were longer term tenors issued some time ago, maybe 2-3 months ago, it was very long term. Then it came down to only 1 or 2 years, and that's it. But Treasury bills has been always getting much higher. But now last auction yesterday, it has 1 year Treasury bills have come down to about 24%. So you can see, as the IMF funding came in, there is more confidence that has come in, and this interest rates will continue to come down.
Thank you very much, Ravi Abesuri, Advocacy Chair, Director of CFA Society, Sri Lanka. A lot of questions are coming to my mind, but I'm going to leave that until the second round. So let's now focus our attention on Talal Rafi, economist and senior global management consultant at Deloitte. Talal, also with regard to domestic debt restructuring. So putting into perspective what Ravi said, there should be a domestic debt restructuring that takes place in the country based on the IMF recommendations. Now, if you don't do what the IMF has recommended, we won't get the second tranche. So that's the risk that we are facing as a country. So it's important that we stick to the recommendations and the guidelines provided by the IMF on paper, and that was tabled in Parliament by President Ranil Wickremesinghe. What is your take with regard to domestic debt restructuring?
So, first of all, thank you very much for having me on the show. First of all, regarding domestic debt restructuring, as Ravi said, it's going to be something that where you shouldn't go unless you have absolutely no other choice. Because the effects are very high. The banking, about 40% of their assets are in government securities. So if there is any sort of this thing, it's going to affect not just the banking sector, but insurance, EPF, ETF, and others. So, but at the same time, we cannot move without doing it as well. So there has to be some sort of adjustment going on where we can finally balance it. That was also put in at the letter by the private creditors to the IMF before. So if you look at it, sort of like it's almost like half is external and half is domestic. But if you look at the payments for 2023, a very huge amount comes almost, if we are going to keep paying the external and the domestic, about 75% of the payment would be for domestic in the year 2023. But interestingly, for 2024, domestic, the payments would come below the external, because it's a lot to do with the amount of Treasury bills that were issued last year. So it's going to be a sort of a tough thing to do, but at the same time, it's got to be done as well. But at the same time, like if I may take the liberty to talk a bit about the IMF program as well. You see, I just want to say this, but there is a lot of talk about criticizing the IMF. But people need to know that we are going to the IMF because we have absolutely no other alternative. You see, there was a previous speaker who was saying that, when really pushed, what is the alternative? Go with a bilateral, go and talk to China, go and talk to Japan or India, and, sort out something, get their investments, get support from them. Like, for example, let's take, we avoid the IMF and go to China and try to talk in and this thing. You see, we still have to restructure our debt. And China does not have the authority or the good relationship with the others to do this. So the only authority that has the clout and the sort of, what do you say, the right or thing that is accepted by all countries is the IMF. So we are there because we have no other choice. And the second thing is, there is also a criticism about the IMF pushing poverty or, not being a friend of the poor. So there is a thing saying, when it comes to social security net, the IMF says 0.7% of GDP should be spent on that. So that is something that the IMF takes into account, even taking into account inflation. So even if there is inflation, the rates would be adjusted because the 0.7 to GDP ratio has to be maintained when it comes to social security. So these are just my thoughts.
Talal, very quickly tell us with regard to this IMF program that has come into play. If you look at many countries, some countries have gone to the IMF, but just taken their recommendations into play and not taken the money. Example, countries like Belize. They went to the IMF, they got their recommendations, but did not get a tranche per se. In a situation like that, do you think that the Sri Lankan government, if it did not implement the recommendations put forward in the IMF report in question, that we may have the risk of not getting the second tranche?
Yes, because right now, to give the context, we are going in a situation where absolutely bankrupt. So we have, it was the president at that time who said that this is a bankrupt nation. And also we are getting financial assurance, and we have to, the next stage is debt restructuring, talking to our partners. So in this thing, a reason why this would be different and we have to move forward is because not just about the IMF program. Like earlier in the 16, everybody claims that, you know, out of the 16 programs, we just walked out of 9. And whether this time it's different because there are powerful players like China, India, Japan, who are going to, you know, not take a actual haircut, but maybe reprofiling, but they are going to lose out a bit. So these are powerful players that who would ensure that we toe the line. So there will be pressure even if there is a change in government. Because
in other words, no hanky-panky this time, my friend?
I don't think so, because I don't think you can mess around with countries such as China or especially China.
Right. Thank you very much, Talal Rafi, economist and senior global management consultant at Deloitte. We're going for a short commercial break. When we come back, we will open the floor for questions from our journalists. Tonight, our topic is restructuring SOEs and domestic debt restructuring in Sri Lanka in light of the IMF report. You can direct your questions to the number 076 656 5353. Stay connected, stay with Face the Nation. We will be right back. Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. We open the floor for questions. On to my immediate right is Shania Darigam. On to my immediate left is Nadim Majid. Let's start off with Shania.
Thank you, Samuel. Ms. Abhisuriya, I have a question that has sort of piqued the interest of the public, which is, are our targets realistic? So our debt restructuring target is end of April this year, and our balance sheets need to be restructured for, you know, SOEs like CPC and CEB by June 2023. So I think the question is, are the targets realistic?
In my view, we have to implement these targets whether we like it or not, because our second tranche from IMF will come by only if we deliver on those targets. Previously, IMF programs, they give the money and say, please implement this. This time it is different. They say you have to meet the targets to get the next tranche. For the first tranche, we implemented each and every target that was given. So our choice is very limited. It's quite challenging, I will agree, but we have to implement it. Implementation is a must.
In 4 weeks, that's the question, because we are almost, 1st of April now.
Yeah, but they will have to buy some time. Most probably there may be delays. So until we implement, the second tranche won't come on the date that they have promised. That's all that can happen. They will say, okay, complete everything. Like a teacher saying, come back, finish your homework and come back. So we will have to implement what we have promised. Everything what we have promised, not what IMF has given. So in the letter of intent, it's very clearly laid out. It says we commit to undertake comprehensive economic adjustment. So we have committed to do this.
Mr. Abhisuriya, on that, you know, so the important point here is, it's not about IMF giving the next tranche. It's about achieving the end game we want through the program. Now, even if, as per IMF assessment, even if we do all what is required, it is only in 2027 we will be able to go to international markets. It will be only by that time the rating agencies will give us a rating which will allow us to raise money in the international financial markets, right? So it's all about getting the economy to a sustainable track. So meeting the, in some ways it's the wrong question, you know, it's not about IMF, it's about we have to get our economy back to where it was at minimum over the next 4 to 5 years. If we get late in implementing these things, it will take a much longer time.
So there's a question, I think there's a question from one of our viewers directed at Ravi. So let me pose that question, Nadeem, and then you can take over from there. It is unfair for Ravi Abesoria to say public can take a hit on the restructuring and not the banks. He doesn't know the people have invested their life savings and earned an honest hard work living in terms of the government securities. If we take a loan from a bank and default, they will sell the security we provided, which could be property or fixed deposits. So why won't the government sell its assets and pay the debts or give property to its debt holders?
That is already happening, because you can see there is a clear condition for SOE restructuring to happen. While that's going on, we have to have the debt sustainability achieved. Yes, I will totally agree with you. I have also invested in Treasury Bills and bonds, but unfortunately when you look at greater things, you have to have a fair play. Again, it says fair burden sharing across all creditors. So yes, banking system can take on maybe 5%. Beyond that, it will hit the banking system again. So banking system stability is paramount for a country if we are to maintain the country's economic system to happen. So that is why it is important. We also take a hit. It will be different, because what will happen is maybe the people who are getting 30% return may end up with getting 20%. It's a share of burden that we have to take.
I was actually going to ask you about the restructuring negotiations, but let's sort of focus on this issue here on the Treasury Bills.
Yeah.
We asked this question last week as well, and there is still not a lot of clarity surrounding it. So not bonds per se, but bills. T-bills are short-term instruments.
Right.
How are you going to restructure, let's say, a 3-month T-bill option?
Yeah.
How
See, now again, we all thought Treasury bills will be excluded because it is either 3, 6 or 12 months, nothing beyond that. But again, it came to be because in this document, they have mentioned something to do with all, including Treasury bills, to be considered in the domestic treasury.
So the IMF is saying that we need to be restructuring
IMF is
T-bills.
saying it now. So that is why now this is included. We all thought it's out.
Isn't that like Treasury bills being subject to restructuring is that's sort of unprecedented, isn't it?
It is unprecedented. Usually it is not.
I can't think of any examples of past, like even in other countries that have sought IMF assistance, where they've had to sort of take restructuring on T-bills, which is the government's sort of short-term financing instrument.
Yeah, but remember, Treasury bills were paying 30% or around that previously. So now it has come down to 24%. So people will hopefully not have the situation where people who are getting much lesser interest will have the same impact of those people who are getting 30%.
So I recollect, Ravi, when we interviewed Dr. Nandlal Veerasinghe, the governor of the central bank, a few months ago, when he was appointed as the governor, we asked him about Treasury bills. We asked him, you pay around 30%, is there a risk factor? And what he said was, there is a high risk, and as a result of that, there is a high interest rate that is being paid as well. So people have to put that also into account, isn't it, Dr. Ekanayake?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
See, again, the issue here is the size of the problem. The debt sustainability issue there is so big. The debt pile is so large for us to come to a situation where debt service becomes possible without default. That is sustainability, right? If you don't take a big cut with the bondholders, domestic, overseas, everybody, right? Then you have to take wait a much longer time to come back to a sustainable situation, right? Now, as I said earlier, as per the current action framework, it still takes 4 to 5 years. Now, if you don't take a reasonable big enough cut, then it will take 10 years. So do you think, this nation, this economy can survive to be the
But IMF page number 57 also talks about net present value. it very clearly articulates that the central bank will have to take a hit there as well. How do you view this, Ravi, when it comes to the IMF program and it clearly articulating that the net present value will be under stress when you do domestic debt restructuring?
Yeah. See, net present value calculation has different impacts. One is the tenor. If you prolong the tenor.
So let's make it very simple for the people to understand. Right. Let's say you make an investment of 1 million Sri Lankan rupees on Treasury Bills for 1 year. So if the government decides to prolong, reprofile it for 10 years, that means would the people still receive the interest component for the next 10 years? Let's make it very simple for the people.
Let me correct you. Treasury bills is usually 1 year.
Yeah, 1 year.
I don't think it will be 10 years.
Yeah, but if they say we want to reprofile all this debt, so then what happens?
So different tenors cannot have the same tenor after reprofiling.
Right.
Because say for 2 years cannot be 10 years.
Right.
And 10 years cannot be 12 years.
Right. Okay.
So it has to be some proportion which is fair by each and every tenor.
Right.
So Treasury bills,
so when you say reprofiling, let's say someone has invested 1 million Sri Lankan rupees on Treasury bills.
Right.
What sort of impact would that be to that particular person in question?
Yeah. So that means it could be an extension of say another year, or worst case 2 years to get your money back. So repayment. But in the whole period of 3 years, you will get 6 monthly coupon payment, which is at 20%. So, you are at least getting the interest income, whereas the repayment of the principal may not come in 1 year as promised. So, it's a kind of a default. But that is what is called NPV, because time value of money. So, there is a NPV impact to the individual or institution who has invested in that.
So, the danger here is, now let's say the government cannot even print money based on this IMF report. So that puts a further stress on the system, isn't it?
Absolutely, because government cannot also borrow without paying a premium for this additional risk that you are going to have an NPV impact on investments in Treasury bills and bonds, which was not there earlier. This is after the IMF document came into being. Only now it's questioned whether Treasury bills and Treasury bonds will be impacted. We all hope the negotiations will be such that these will be excluded. That's what the public wants, that's what we all want. But the question is that sustainability. So ultimately it's a formula where how much haircut the external debt is going to take. My view is it could be 40%, it could be 50% if they all agree. Well and good. So, but still, even if they take a 50% haircut, we cannot reach the 95% of our debt to GDP target of 95%, even if they take 50%.
Talal, I'd like to get your thoughts on this sort of restructuring as well, because you mentioned earlier about how actually last week we had Sujiva Mudalige, one of your competitors, was on the program, and he was talking about the stress that the domestic banking system is under, and how in the IMF report they're talking about the need for banks to recapitalize as well.
Right.
If the banks are as stressed, I mean, you agree with that statement that banks are under a lot of stress?
Yes, of course.
So if the banks are under such a lot of stress, I mean, these are banks that, to be fair, 2-3 years ago were reporting profits in the billions of, quarterly profits in the billions of rupees. So if they are so stressed, don't you think that domestic restructuring of this nature, and we agree that restructuring of Treasury bills is unprecedented.
Right.
So in the event that we see that kind of sort of extreme domestic debt restructuring, couldn't it trigger a collapse in the banking system?
Yes, of course. There is also, like for example, if you take Ireland had an economic crisis because of a banking crisis. And we were looking at it like Ireland, the whole banking crisis started when non-performing loans started hitting the double digits. But currently in Sri Lanka, we are at around 12%. So even not about non-performing loans, even loans that are a bit stressed would come to around 33%. Ravi might know better. So, but like I said, I'm not advocating for domestic debt restructuring, but for example, I wouldn't really agree with it because of the factors. Some of them were kept constant, the rates were, but Verite put out a thing saying that if, for example, even if the bondholders took a 50% haircut in principle, in their principal itself, and the bilaterals took a 25 thing, at this rate, in 10 years, our debt would still go up to 136 without a domestic restructuring. So there are certain ways we can tackle it otherwise. One is increasing taxes. So that is not going to be very politically sustainable. Second is through inflation. So, we can inflate our rupee, reduce it down. That is also not going to be another thing. The third thing would be, in my opinion, an easier thing would be, rapid privatization, sort of this thing. Go for the domestic restructuring and use the money from the privatization thing to use as a fund that the IMF requires the central bank to sort of put a roadmap to recapitalize the banks.
So, Mr. Fernando, I think based on what Talal is saying, this is where we can bring you in on this conversation. So that makes the work of the unit or the subcommittee that you're within the state-owned enterprise restructuring unit into very sharp focus, because this is a lot of responsibility on you all. So, because as Talal says, maybe rapid privatization is the way out.
I think so, because if you really look at one of the problems we have in the budget and the fiscal management is the losses incurred by state enterprises. If you look at over the past few years and take the profits that are made by the two state banks, which are neutralizing some of the losses, those profits are also suspect, because there are people who say that correct provisions are not being made in those two banks. So if you leave that aside, it runs into a couple of billions each year, the losses made by the state enterprises. So the restructuring of the economy, if we are going to bring fiscal discipline into the budget, you have to really take away that loss that is incurred. So, and also there are, if you look at the state enterprises, it is a legacy that we have from a socialist economy era, where we created large state enterprises by taking over the buses, insurance, and so on. And we created large enterprises, state enterprises, and they have been making losses over the years. So the question is, the world has changed though from that socialist kind of thinking where the commanding heights of an economy must be held by the state. That philosophy is gone today. So no one is really wedded to that kind of policy.
Just to pose a question to you, a very open-ended question. Do you recollect the 2nd of April 2018? What happened? 2018. Do you recollect? Does it ring a bell?
What are you referring to?
April 2nd, 2018. Do you remember the date? Is it a significant milestone in your life? May I remind you, that's the day that you were appointed as the chairman of Sri Lankan Airlines a few years ago. So when you were appointed as the chairman of Sri Lankan Airlines, there was a statement issued by the airline in question. It says, a new board of directors under the chairmanship of Mr. Ranjit Fernando has been appointed to Sri Lankan Airlines in order to accelerate the restructuring process and create the enabling environment to proceed with entering into a public-private partnership with a strategic investor. Now, you lasted at Sri Lankan Airlines only for 7 months. You quit in November 2018 when there was a constitutional crisis. What happened there?
See, the Sri Lankan Airlines, when I went in, there were 26 routes that they were flying. 24 of them were making losses. So, and each year the losses amount to a couple of billion rupees. And what happens with that loss? The government gives a guarantee to a commercial bank and wants the airline to borrow to look after that loss. So each year, instead of putting equity into the company, they give a guarantee to a commercial bank, and the commercial bank lends to Sri Lankan Airlines to look after that debt, look after that loss that year. What happens the next year? On that loan itself, there is more interest coming into the Sri Lankan Airlines. The profit and loss account has another burden of that interest on that loan, because it's a loan given to the loss, not equity. So turning around the airline is not an easy thing, because one has to look at, we have gone and bought aircraft without having a business plan, how we run the, so when you run 24 of those routes at a loss, you continue to run those at a loss, turning around is not that easy.
Mr. Fernando, the people, the public who are watching this show tonight may ask or pose a question to you saying, every single time they travel on Sri Lankan Airlines, the flights are always full. You can't even get a seat. Let's take the sector from London to Colombo or from Colombo to Melbourne. These flights are fully packed, or may it be from Colombo to Kuwait or Colombo to Saudi Arabia or Jeddah or Riyadh. These flights are fully packed. Why is it that an airline that is packed full of people in every single journey keep on making losses after losses and become a severe burden on the country's economy?
Very interesting question, and it's a long answer. The point is, in airlines and hotels, now if you book a hotel room in Singapore for August this year, and if you try to over the internet book a room, you will get a very good rate. But if you are trying to get a room next week, then you will have the highest rate, because that is next week. But a long date they will sell. So in airlines and hotels, there is a post called the sales revenue. That person, in addition to the marketing people, there is a guy who really sells the tickets. So if you have a seat airline which is the flight is on, say, 2 months later, you can sell that ticket at a lesser point. But when you get closer to the date, the price goes up. Or if there is an event in that say, for instance, in September, there is a cricket tournament here, and you find expecting visitors to come here, then you won't give that seat at a discount. You will keep that, because you know even closer to the date you can sell the ticket. So in selling tickets, although the airline is full, the occupancy is full, you don't know at what price the ticket has been sold. So managing that sale, timing that issue of how you price your tickets for 3 months ahead, 2 months ahead, 1 month ahead, is a science which really any airline follows.
So, Mr. Fernando, it's very clear that the government now is very steadfast about selling off its stake as far as corporations are concerned, may it be Sri Lankan Airlines, may it be Lanka Hospitals, may it be Sri Lanka Insurance, may it be Sri Lanka Telecom. It's very clear. The government has made it very clear that they don't want to be in the business of operating or managing these enterprises. However, it's very clear now, as someone who's working in the private sector, I will never buy Sri Lankan Airlines if the government is not going to take over the debt aspect of it. Never buy Sri Lankan Airlines or never invest money on Sri Lankan Airlines if the government does not take the debt component out of that equation.
It will have to take the debt component out.
The government is looking at it positively, is it?
Even in the Indian airline sales, Tata's, government took over the debt.
So the Sri Lankan government has to take over the debt.
Definitely.
So is that very clear to the investors?
To my mind, it's very clear. I don't know what the unit will do. I mean, it's up to them to structure the deal. But I think without taking the debt out, I don't think anyone will buy it. So 7 months,
Mr. Fernando, you were at Sri Lankan Airlines. You couldn't strike a deal. How positive are you that we will be able to strike a deal to sell Sri Lankan Airlines, which is a burden to the country's economy?
At one point, we had Emirates buying shares in the airline. So I don't think we can write it off. There is potential if you run it properly. At that time, the airline ran at a profit. So there is really no reason to write off the entire thing. And also, the other thing is, when you really look at Sri Lankan Airlines, I can understand losses in the CEB, because the public is benefiting, at least even if they don't charge the real rate, the public is benefiting. Who benefits from the Sri Lankan Airlines? Not the public. It is some rich people who really want to go on a flight. So what is the justification of government putting billions of rupees each year of public funds to keep that airline afloat?
So Dr. Dunsiga, that is one question.
And also, another thing is, I think the point was made that you run certain organizations with government control for public benefit. There are certain deserving classes that need to be taken care of. Therefore, certain institutions are run at a loss even purely for that.
Yeah.
I think he was referring to certain villages being electrified. Now, certainly the cost is incurred. Even in the airline, you can, even after privatization, you can get those concerns met by the airline. For instance, if tourism is to be promoted by the country, the airline has to play a role. So you can have conditions imposed on that airline to say that you must support your routes with the tourism. You must. So that is possible.
And many airlines have done that in the past as well.
Absolutely,
like,
absolutely.
Qatar Airways or
I don't think there is that is an argument to prevent privatization, because the social needs or the public interest needs can be met even under private.
So, Dr. Guru Singh, it's very interesting. I got this question from one of our viewers who are watching the show tonight. So, the UNP-led government or president now, Ranil Wickremesinghe, is talking about privatization now. But let's take a look at an organization that is under the UNP, which is a private entity. Are you aware of this organization, Dr. Dhanasinghe?
No.
Okay, so the Jatika Sevaka Sangame of the UNP is handling Hotel de Buhari, if you are not aware of it. They've been handling it since 1990. And they've not, the UNP administration has never given that to a new management. So how transparent is this particular process in question? How genuine is the government or the president is with regard to privatization when there is a company that is with the UNP for a prolonged period of time? They could probably give it to another management as well. They've not done that. So how genuine is the government with regard to its policies now when you speak about privatization?
Yes, I think now we may have a situation of that nature. Certainly, that both parties, in particular the political party in power, they have one way or the other, they have supported their members, their trade unions and the other organization. That is the culture here in Sri Lanka. No? Even the president.
You scratch my back, I scratch your back.
Yes, that is the culture. So that I think what we have learned with the crisis is that we cannot maintain that culture any longer. If we try to maintain that, we will not be able to come out of this crisis. Now, even when you look at this, the program that we have agreed with the IMF, and those things definitely we have to do whether IMF tell us or not, because those the reforms that are there basically to address the root causes of the present crisis. I think that is what we need to understand. For example, we are asked to increase our tax revenue. Why? Our tax revenue remain at a lower in terms of relative to GDP. That is why we have borrowed a lot. That is why we got into the debt crisis. So these are some of the things that definitely we have to address whether IMF tell us or not in order to get out of this crisis.
Professor Dhanasinghe, with sort of privatization as well, it's important to look at how you privatize. I bring this up because you mentioned bus transport earlier and about private buses. Under the first sort of J.R. Jayawardena administration, when they opened up the economy, they also opened up bus transport. But instead of having a few sort of private bus companies, instead of having sort of a corporatized thing, we've sort of created this monster, the private bus sector, where you have 20,000 people owning 20,000 buses, which has made it sort of impossible to regulate. No incentive to sort of maintain service like standards of quality, make quality stand there. And almost every single administration since then has been trying to corporatize this sector and failing. It's gotten so bad that I'm sure you've heard of the incident where Professor Amal Kumarge, when he was a consultant, one of the people working on his team was actually shot on the way to the NTC office.
Yes.
So these are the kinds of problems that you're going to be encountering. How can you prevent this from happening? Because at the end of the day, I mean, you can't really separate the economics from the politics of it as well. That's why you call it the political economy. How are you going to ensure that, because at the end of the day, the politicians will not want to give up their power to make appointments, the sort of the discretionary powers that they have, which enable them to maintain their little kutia. So how are you going to, how can we sort of prevent that, stop that from infecting the restructuring process?
Yeah, definitely the solution lie on the strengthening the institutional setup and the legal setup. Now, we, as you very correctly mentioned, now look at, you have this bakery association. They set the price for the island. Then you have the egg producers association. Now, what we can see is that they run different mafias, no? For different association, they have different mafias. Now, on that ground, this is the challenge. I mean, even when you restructure, privatize, this is the challenge that we need to set up relevant, I mean, required institutional and legal framework in place in order to avoid that, you know, the owners or the private entities will not exploit the situation. I think that is a requirement now, even to correct some of the errors that we have committed. Now, very simple thing. Now, issuing a ticket by a private bus, you know, we fail to do that even, you know, after say 40 years, they still do not issue a ticket now. So how you think about like getting a, like say private entities to promote Sri Lanka tourism or to provide that electricity to a rural area. Now even the telecom, what the telecom, the role telecom played during the COVID-19 when the country's, you know, education is online and a lot of work is online, but what the role that it played. I mean, when the president went, okay, 4G was given, no? Here then he called Savendro somebody, and you know, we don't have the signal and all. Then the 4G was given some, you know, during that time, only few locations. No, other than that, telecom did not play any role at all. No? Given it is highly required in order to make sure that work, you know, online and learn online and all these things. So those are the situations where, I mean, when you say privatization, certainly we have to do. I mean, I have no objection to that, but we need to set up the required institutional framework and the legal framework in place.
So
prior to that.
So your take on, let's say, the state-owned enterprise restructuring unit as it has been set up right now, and when you look at its mandate, does that, as an academic at the University of Colombo, does it inspire confidence in you that this unit will get privatization done right?
I cannot say for sure without knowing in detail whether the legal mandate given to that unit in a way that the particular chairman of that unit to take independent decisions and the speed of that process. Now, if it is within a very short period, if you are to do that, can we make sure that the required framework in place? But these are some of the things that we need to take into account.
The biggest problem that we are facing as a nation is the heads of these organizations. Now, Dr. Dunasinghe spoke about Sri Lanka Telecom, for an example. The chairman is appointed by a political appointee who is responsible to protect the interest of his constituency or his petty political agendas. That's how it works, unravels in Sri Lanka, unfortunately. If it's Lanka hospitals, the chairman is appointed by the government again. If you take a look at Sri Lankan Airlines, how important is it for the government to withdraw itself completely out of this equation? Why is it so important? Now, even you, Mr. Fernando, you were also a political appointee by 2018 Yapalne government. How important is it to withdraw from this process?
I must say, you might say in a way that I was a political appointee, but I was not appointed by virtue of the fact that I was a party supporter or
No, absolutely,
I had absolutely nothing
yes,
to do with the party. I took it as a professional being appointed with my record in the banking sector of being appointed to run the airline. But if you really take the whole question of a corporate entity has three bodies. The shareholders who appoint the board and the board appoints management. Those are the three bodies if you take the anatomy of a corporate entity, any company. So even if it's a government is the owner, they appoint the board and the board appoints management. That's how it goes. But when it comes to government is a very loose entity. Who in government appoints the party? It is the minister who is subject to all kinds of political pressures. So he appoints the parties and he is pressurized to give favoritism to some other catchers that he has, and that is how the whole thing is. It is not a professional appointment of a professional into the thing. It is chosen on party line.
So now, Mr. Fernand, you've been appointed to head a subcommittee to look at all these aspects as well. Enlighten us, make us cognizant about the role of your subcommittee in this entire restructuring process.
So we have taken a complete position of divorcing government ownership from management. Management has to be professional, and we are trying to take away all the influence that a government has, that a political party has on running the particular institution. If there are public interest concerns that you need them to serve a public cause, that can come through not a board member appointed to the company. The board is purely a professional board. So what is structured now today is that there will be a holding company which will own all the state-owned enterprises. So there will be state-owned enterprises for electricity, petroleum and so on, and all those. There are 50 odd strategic SOEs. They will be having boards of their own, corporatized boards. That board will report to a holding company which is a powerful board, and there it's the private sector. People from professionals of unblemished character, of integrity will be appointed on that board, not political appointees. And that board will control these other boards and set the program at the beginning of the year. There will be a contract or performance contract signed with each board.
Like KPIs?
Like KPIs. And they'll be dismissed or kept on those performance criteria.
Who will be responsible for sort of monitoring this and ensuring that these are met? Is it the political authority that is going to be monitoring this, or are we going to have independent commission or like some yeah?
So in the holding company board, we are suggesting a board of 8 people, right? And those 5 of them will come from the private sector, and those people will be nominated by professional bodies like the Chartered Institute, the other institutes that are the Engineers Institute, the BSL, and all those people will have a pool of people who are possible directors, people with integrity, people who have served the private sector in unblemished with leadership qualities. So the stature of that board will really be the success or failure of this whole enterprise. If you have people of integrity in that board who will push away government interference, not allow anyone to interfere with the working of these boards, that's the only way we can think of these entities being run on commercial terms. So that's what we are trying to do, remove government influence totally from the running of these institutions.
Sorry, Mr. Abisoi, I actually have like based on another sort of economist at the University of Colombo just sent this statement in regarding this T-bill issue. He said what the IMF report is, this Mr. Umesh Muramuduli was saying that what the IMF report is talking about is reprofiling T-bills owned by the CBSL. It is a way of restructuring, but it will not affect any T-bill holders, because all the T-bills which are likely to be converted into bonds are owned by the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, aka Monetary.
That's correct.
Yeah. So he's saying that people like retail investors, like let's say, you and I don't have to worry about taking a hit on our T-bills.
That's
because
exactly what we want, no question about it. But what is being also discussed is this is a negotiation that has to happen. It is not IMF rules that apply there. It is a discussion between the external debtors and our banks who are also having external debt of Sri Lanka as well as the government of Sri Lanka. So obviously it will come to a favorable I would say conclusion. I am fully agreeable to have only the central bank debt to be considered in the restructuring.
Yeah.
However, there are schools of thought that if we bring everybody else into the picture, there will be a lesser haircut or NPV. That is what it is. Yeah. Let me add something very interesting. Mr. Fernando talked about Sri Lankan Airlines. Now, if you take the loss of Sri Lankan Airlines, 8 months loss, that is equivalent to all the tax increases for 1 year. Right? So this is the magnitude we are talking of.
And for whose benefit?
For whose benefit? And it's a when you think about Sri Lanka, it's a crime.
Yes. And who did this?
It's a crime.
Just imagine what happened. We came, suddenly won the World Cup, and Emirates were owning this airline. We went and took over. And how much of billions the public of this country paid, having taken over Sri Lankan Airlines, which was previously given to Emirates Airlines, and completely government of Sri Lanka was not incurring losses.
I can tell you some of the things that all directors enjoyed free tickets for family, set of free tickets that were given to all the board directors. And those tickets, even if they left the airline, they could use those tickets. There was one director, for instance, who rang me when I was chairman and said, look, I have these free tickets given to me and the family. I came from London to Colombo, went to Australia, and when I came to Colombo again to go to UK, now they say the tickets are cancelled. So that was the first decision, one of the decisions we took at the first board. No more free tickets and cancel all the outstanding tickets. And directors I did not even take a salary for the period I served. So I told him, look, the airline is running at a loss. We can't give you these free tickets. Why don't you buy a ticket to London? You have had free tickets. So
no, the arrogance of one individual
absolutely
led to all this. And then as a result, they even built another airline called Sri Lanka.
Let me complete the story. So he said, how can you, I'm going to the Prime Minister and the President. I said, you can go to the, so the Prime Minister rang me and said, look, you have cancelled. I said, you wanted me to run the airline at a profit.
Yeah, but Mr. Fernando, what I witnessed as appalling is, now look at 2015, when the government wanted change, when the people wanted change, they appointed Maithripala Sirisena as the President of the country. Ranil Wickremesinghe as the Prime Minister, automatically he was appointed. The first thing the President did was to appoint his brother to Sri Lanka Telecom with the highest salary.
That is the whole issue of the SOEs. Really, if you take now the questions that you raised about the bus, individuals running buses, I think we have no black and white answers to many of those questions. It has to evolve. I think at some point it will evolve to fleet owners. It will evolve. Really, given the right conditions and the directions, it will evolve to that, because you can't run profitability a single bus unless you have a garage to do the repairs, and so it has to come to that, but it will evolve. But I think there is no way that we can continue with the state ownerships. Look at what has happened to Seat Kalani. Seat Kalani was Kalani Tires, a Russian plant that was given, and it was running at a loss. The Indians bought it. Today, we export tires to the world and running at a huge profit.
We'll come back to Talal. I know you have something to say. I'll come back to you, yes. Yeah.
Look at Ceylon Glass, glass company, which was bought by Piramal in India. Today, we export glass to the rest of the world. To America, we export. To Australia, we export. Some of those whiskey bottles with different shapes are made in the factory here. We have upgraded the facility. And telecom itself, I mean, look at the change. When I entered law college, there was a lecturer who used to say, congratulations in joining law college. You have entered to become a lawyer. I would advise you to apply for your telephone now, because by the time you pass out, you will get your telephone. That was the situation in the telephones. But today, 24 hours, you can get a connection. So those are the changes, plantation companies. Then NDB itself, we were...
I want to ask a success story of NDB as well. 1993, it was completely privatized.
Yes.
The government sold its shares.
Yeah. I can tell you now, now there are people who say that privatization was a big mistake. Howard Nicholas, for instance, had been on record saying that privatizing of the development banks was a huge mistake.
This is the same economist who said printing money
absolutely. So he's a friend of mine, but I must say, now here is the record of the NDB lending. You can see the graph going up. This is the point we were making just a small 100 million profit. Then the lending, here's the lending, this is the lending, how it has gone up. From 5 billion to 50 billion a month. The whole record of increasing after privatization. So privatization was not the issue really here. We performed much better under privatization conditions.
And new management.
Management. And we were subject to all kinds of political pressures. We resisted it. NDB and DFCC didn't go the way the People's Bank and the Bank of Ceylon went. We never entertained any political interference. We were strong because we were set up with World Bank assistance, and the culture within never permitted, no one went for a promotion to a minister. We wouldn't have promoted him at all.
Dr. Ekanaka, when we speak about privatization, I think many people are of the opinion that privatization is bad. But I know in 1992, you were one of the pioneers who were involved in reducing the plantation operating companies. There was a company called the Janata Estate Development Board and the SPC, the State Plantation Corporation. So when you speak about all this, these are success stories in terms of privatization. Can you enlighten us about the good deeds that took place after the privatization of the plantation sector in Sri Lanka?
See, just before privatization, the two corporations were so indebted to the Bank of Ceylon and People's Bank to the extent the viability of the two state banks were at risk, right? So that tells a huge story. I used to be, in the initial days I was the Director of Planning at the Plantation Ministry. Every month we had to run to the Treasury to get some money to pay the salaries of the employees.
So there were 450 companies at that time, if I'm not mistaken. Estates
separate
at that time.
estates. Yeah. Where really the estates should have made profits and paid taxes to the government, right? Instead, government was using public money, either both tax money as well as loan funds, the funds which would have been available for productive investments to the rest of the economy were being used to fund two massive loss-making giants. In fact, this is another public sector thing. Sri Lanka is a small country, and these two corporations were at that time said to be the largest agricultural entities in the whole world. In the whole world, right? And they could not survive. They could not function. They could not perform profitably. There was a time government made a lot of money by way of export duties. As the two plantation companies, the corporations, started making losses, in a series of steps the government had to reduce the export duties and finally abandon it altogether, right? So that was where it was, and our crop yield and the working conditions of the people were among the worst in the whole world. Today, the privatized plantation companies, if you put all of them together, are running profitably. There have been one or two companies which have made losses, which is normal. right?
And that's the way
Made losses.
business unfolds. You can't, not everyone is going to make a profit.
Absolutely. But the point is, as a sector, the estate sector in the plantation industry, in the economy, is now self-financing. They are paying lease rents for the land they occupy, and when they make profits, they pay corporate taxes.
36%.
Also,
30%.
Also, huge strides have been made in terms of the housing conditions, health and other facilities available for plantation workers. There's still a gap. And that must be bridged as fast as possible. But the change from where it was is enormous. So what shows is that under commercial undertakings, under private management, of course, as Mr. Fernando and also Dr. Dunisinghe said, some degree of guidance, right? The general public can benefit, and that's the story.
That's the norm. That's the story at the end of the day. Bottom line.
2001, all the losses made by state enterprises amounted to 2.86 trillion. That is the loss made. 790 million a day. All the losses. I mean, how can we run a country with this? And if you look at look at Shangri-La. Take the example of Shangri-La. Now we sold that land. There are people who say we sold the family silver to foreign parties. We could have had that land and kept it there. What is the problem? We could have kept that land. But what comes out of the land? Here is Shangri-La, a well-known hotel chain in the world, coming here, investing a couple of billion rupees in the project, their own money, and giving employment to 1,000 people. They have Hambantota property also, which runs a golf course, all that. And more than that, there are tourists who won't come to Sri Lanka unless there is a facility like Shangri-La. They won't stay in a $150 hotel. If you look at Adrian Seka, who was interviewed recently in the press, he's one of the most well-known hoteliers. Now, I happened to, with Mr. Soli Captain, who was on the board of NDB, I had breakfast with him at Hilton. And Soli asked him, what is it that you give for $1,000 a room to your people? What do you serve extra to what we do in our hotel? He said, it's just exclusivity. His clientele don't come on advertisements. He has a clientele list.
A niche market.
Niche market where he really says he promotes the hotel to those people directly, and they come and pay $1,000. Now Shangri-La brought that kind of hotel into Sri Lanka and the tourists that come to Sri Lanka. So the only thing that is objectionable in that deal and in the whole question of privatization, one is our people have been misled by the old socialist norms of, state owning everything. Don't give it to privates, exploitation by the privates. Secondly, the corruption that goes on with privatization. Even in the Shangri-La hotel, it is well known that some people made billions of dollars on that deal.
Yeah, so just on that itself, I just want to pick Ravi. I'm coming to you, Talal. I know that you've been waiting to express your views. I'm coming back to you, but because we're on the subject of privatization. Ravi, you were part of Sri Lanka Insurance when Gamini Senarat was appointed as a chairman. And if I may recollect right, you walked out at that time from the board of directors at Sri Lanka Insurance, and then Gamini Senarat appointed his classmates. So stooges who were very close to him, accomplices, let's put it that way. And then the construction of Grand Hyatt took place. Tell us the story behind this, so the people are made aware of what happened there.
Yeah, so if you go back a little bit of history, what happened was Sri Lankan Insurance was owned by Harry Javadala, and it was a private owned entity.
Yes.
Through a Supreme Court case, because of valuation, it was taken over and given back to the
Sri Lankan government. Yes.
And Supreme Court had a very clear direction you need to have professionals appointed with these skill sets to run SLIC. So
that can that's above the budgets of the health and education thing. So we can literally double the universities. Look at how many people don't have a seat to go to university. 90%.
12,000 people enter university.
Yes.
See, how many people are just going abroad because we cannot accommodate them in our universities.
Yes. Now, classic example is individuals like Shania, you know, studied in the local system, now trying to go overseas to do their higher education because the education system in Sri Lanka itself has failed miserably.
Yes, more than 10,000 students leave every year. If you talk to a friend, where are you? I was just asking Anura, what about the children? Say both are abroad. If you ask any friend of yours, they are abroad. They won't come back also.
And look at the foreign currency that we are sending out in the country.
Dollars. And also each child now in the London University, you spend at least 10,000 sterling pounds a year to fund that education. What if we set up those universities? They were willing to come here at one time. And if we set up the universities here, there will be children from India and other countries who will come and study here. Because Sri Lanka is such a pleasant place.
Because I recollect, Mr. Fernando, you know, there was a time that medical institutes were trying to establish in Sri Lanka, and at that time the Government Medical Officers Association vehemently rejected this proposal. And now when the doctors are leaving to better opportunities overseas, and they're still making a fuss, you know.
And the beauty is now a certain political party were saying these are Upadhi Kada. But if you look at the true picture, their own children are abroad. In Upadhi Kada.
Yes. And also I would like to add that, you see, what we have seen in Sri Lanka is that after 91, in India's case, or South Korea, or like Thailand, you see, in those countries, there is no debate about whether privatization is good or not. You see, they have already agreed and moved forward. Like, for example, how in 1977, after President J.R. Jayawardena pushed the country to the path of open economy, you see, when Chandrika Bandaranaike came in from 94 to 2005, there was a sort of a consensus, you know. Sri Lanka Telecom was privatized by an SLFP government, which was thought to be the most left-wing. But then we saw that that's how we should have been. For 40 years, we had a sort of a consensus. After 2005, things changed. Not just in terms of privatization. I want to speak about the other thing is more focus into import substitution. You see, to have an export-oriented economy, we are one of the most protected economies in the world. So we cannot, you see, now the trend has moved more into global supply chains. Like, for example, how Vietnam. Like, let me give the example how Professor Premachandra Athukurella always says, China, to make an iPhone, imports components from 43 different countries. A manufacturing superpower such as China, even the United States can't compete with, cannot make an iPhone in its own country. Needs imports from 43 different countries.
Just to add to what you're saying, 70% of trade in the world now is all components.
Exactly.
All components.
Yes. Components. We are not in that game. So unless we join the world and become part of that system, Sri Lanka is not going to go anywhere.
We have to open the countries.
We need to have FTAs.
Take for instance now these industries. Now take milk, for instance. We import, we need 722 million liters of milk for the country. That's the requirement. Local supply is only 422 million liters. And we spend $365 million US a year to import powdered milk. And we add water and give it to the children. Now there is nothing to really prevent us setting up those industries here. Milk, the plantation companies have enough land. If they give the workers a cow, like what Kurian did in India, it was not big farms that he set up, small holdings, where he provided the feed for the animal and he took the milk. People came and there were collecting centers. Now there is nothing to really prevent a plantation company. Give a cow to each guy, have a collecting center, have veterinary surgeons in the company attending to these. So take sugar. Sugar again, we import $288 million US worth of sugar a year. That's again something we can do here easily.
So Mr. Fernando, when you speak about all this, I recollect today I had a meeting with a Japanese giant in terms of a multinational company which is operating in Sri Lanka. They were saying that they have ventured into milk, and they were importing cows from New Zealand and Australia, and they've been able to capitalize, and as a result of that, today they are the number 7 player in the Japanese market. What would Sri Lanka do? There would be corruption involved.
There again we had corruption.
When we were getting down cows, you know, and all the cows died. So, that is the pity that, you know,
another industry which we are surrounded by the sea. And the story is that our fish in the sea surrounding us die of old age because no one catches them. So if you really take the fishing industry, I know of one company which really exported cut fish into products which were the loin and other parts. They value added and set them. They earned $40 million a year. $40 million a year for 4 years consecutively. But then the EU ban came, and we don't have the fishing vessels. We don't catch enough sea, because at that time foreign vessels were allowed to come here and fish and get the fish into these companies. And Sri Lanka prospered at that time. So we changed those policies, and again these are some things that you can revive again.
And if you look at it, Mr. Van, I don't know whether you know or whether you're aware that most of the fish that are being sold at 5-star hotels in Sri Lanka are sourced from China.
Yeah.
We being an island nation. So Dr. Dudusinghe, I want to pick your brain on the opposition role now. We saw several weeks ago the SJB government, SJB not government, SJB as a party, they want to come into government, but there has to be an election for that to happen. So Iran Vikramaratne, who is one of the economic pundits, said that the threshold of the taxation has to be brought to 300,000, and based on that only the tax policies have to come into effect as far as the pay tax 200,000, and that's how the pay tax has to come into effect. And then we saw recently another economic pundit of the SJB, that's Dr. Harshan De Silva, saying that the taxation should be over 40% for those who are high income earners, while maintaining a tax of 25% of tax rate for those who are earning a monthly income of 500,000. Now they split policy. This is one party which is having two different policies. So as someone who's been watching these political parties play, don't you think that the opposition has to have one voice when it comes to the country's economy?
Yeah, I think this is the same play or the kind of behavior that we have seen over the years. Whenever in the opposition, you try to, provide a kind of alternative, which is really not the best alternative for the country. In fact, even now in this context, I think the sad side of this is that those with sound knowledge in economics and the economic situation in the country, when they propose certain alternative policies which knowingly that may not work in the current context. For example, if I go by this Honorable Iran Vikramaratne's proposal, raising the threshold to 200,000, and how he is planning to get the revenue. Same revenue. What is the alternative? The alternative he has proposed is the tobacco tax on tobacco. Okay, by increasing tobacco tax. But whether it is tobacco or the alcohol, there is a limit. When you pass that limit, actually tax revenue come down. That is the logic. Okay, so without analyzing that even, what has happened to right now, the tax that you collect from the alcohol and tax that you collect from the tobacco, without even analyzing that, you simply propose, okay, we plan to increase the tobacco tax and raise the threshold to the income tax level. I think that is not the issue right now with respect to direct tax. the issue is that there is a sizable segment which who are eligible but do not pay taxes. Yes. Why they are not pay taxes? You think that Inland Revenue Department people do not know them? No, that is not the case. They know. That segment is kept aside by the officers in the Inland Revenue Department and the private tax assessors as well as the politicians, because they can have their own earnings and illegal earnings from that segment.
It's like the electricity bill. Some ministers don't pay the electricity bill, but if we don't pay the electricity bill for 1 month,
yes,
it's disconnected.
That is the situation. This is the situation. I think they exactly know there are people who in particular who are operating in the informal sector.
Right.
I mean, if you have a proper plan to get them into the tax net, certainly I think that higher tax rates right now applied on payee could be reduced to some extent.
So, Dr. Dhanasinghe, you've been watching politicians from the government and opposition fighting and battling over this IMF matter. Don't you think it's a little bit surprising now how those who oppose the IMF is now saying good things about the IMF and lighting crackers?
Resign. One politician
Yes.
said he will resign when IMF comes.
Yes.
So why is he resigning? I have not seen him resigning.
So all this is happening now. It's like fool's play in Parliament.
No, to some extent, I think this crisis has forced them to think deeply and try to understand the situation in their own way. For example, I saw that one politician saying, you have a bike, you basically buy petrol, then we all are in this dollar crisis, okay, because we have to pay in dollars, okay. What we could see is that certainly some just without an alternative, they have agreed, okay, shall we go with the IMF. And also we have a sizable number, in particular those who just entered into Parliament sometime. They have, I think, looked into this differently, and now they have even understood that IMF provided basically a better alternative, and also not the IMF but some of the issues that IMF has asked us to address are really the problem of the root causes of this economic crisis.
Right. So I want to go for a short commercial break, but Shania, do you have any questions to the gentleman?
Maybe after the break, sir.
Maybe after the break. What about you, Nadir?
After the break.
After the break. So we're going for a short commercial break. When we come back, we speak to Professor Priyanka Dhanasinghe, Dr. Anureka Nayaka, Ranjit Fernando, Talal Rafi, and Ravi Abesuri on the topic restructuring state-owned enterprises and domestic debt restructuring in Sri Lanka. We're going for a short commercial break. When we come back, we will be discussing all these and more. Stay connected, stay with Face the Nation. Welcome back. We are in the final 15 minutes. We'll be ending the show at approximately around 11:45 tonight because we have 5 speakers to grill on in terms of our constructive engagement for the betterment, the future of Sri Lanka. Shania?
Mr. Fernando, I think you touched on some of the issues that you could run into in the privatization program. Something Dr. Howard Nicholas kind of flagged up on the show when he was a guest a couple of weeks ago was that privatization in countries like Argentina, who have been subject to IMF conditions, have not always been successful. I think he cited that the government has no regulation over distribution and price control, specifically citing Intel, their telecommunications. Now that Sri Lanka is entering into its own privatization program, how would these sort of challenges and obstacles be curbed?
As I was describing, the holding company model and the subsidiary holding company is something other countries have done successfully. So we are learning from them. Singapore, for instance, Temasek is a very successful organization which handles all the government entities. When they started, they had 32 public enterprises within them. But now it's boiled down to 12 because they have sold all the others after turning them around. So we are following that model, and even Malaysia has the same model. So we are following those two models, and this holding company structure, we don't have all the answers really ready, because it's a game that we have to really put into practice. But the basic cause of failure of the SOEs has been the political interference. That is well known, and if there is nothing wrong in the company. And also there is a fundamental difference between a public owned enterprise and a private enterprise. Now, I saw an article in the press where someone was saying, why are you blaming the state enterprises for making losses? There are private enterprises also making losses. But there is a fundamental difference. In the case of the private enterprise, there is a limit to the losses that they can make, because he has to put in the money, he loses the money. In a government entity, there is no limit to that. The budget will fund you, and it goes on funding you. So there is no limit. So that is the difference in the thing. It is in the private enterprise, there is someone who carries the can and who suffers from it. So that there is an automatic closure of the thing if he can't survive. But here, that is not the case. Even if it's a loss-making thing, it continues to go on because there is money from the budget. And I think the other question that you asked about the structure and other things I've answered, because we are trying to follow models which have succeeded in other countries. We are getting technical assistance, we will follow those models in facing the issue.
Mr. Fernando, when you speak about the Temasek model, isn't it important for the government to make it absolutely clear that all stakeholders, that it intends to follow the principles of non-interference and non-preference entirely?
Of course, that is fundamental to it. That is fundamental. We should not have...
Or else we will slide back again to the same same system that we are facing today in Sri Lanka.
Absolutely. It depends on how far we are able to move government away from interfering with these organizations and let professionals run the organization.
Not only that, there is another very important component which came up in the private bus. It is the regulation. Because in Sri Lanka, if you go to Hong Kong, there is a private company running all the public buses. But it is very well regulated, and the timing is spot on. It will come exactly on the time. But in Sri Lanka, we have not strengthened the regulatory aspects of the private entities.
So when you travel overseas, Ravi, when you travel to countries like Canada, Singapore, or the UK or US, there is a particular time. You have an app. You would know exactly what time the bus would reach that particular halt in question.
You can set your watch on.
You can set your watch, and you can. That's how development has taken place across the world, and we are just a frog in the well, isn't it, Ravi?
Exactly. See, they are run by private companies, but the government does its job of ensuring private sector also adhere to rule of law, which is missing in our roads, you can see very clearly, and ensuring the public is also served.
But see, if you look at it, when you go to countries like India, now India is moving towards renewable energy in a very big way. And everything is linked to modern day technology, artificial intelligence, robotics, deep machine learning. And digitalization. Where are we as a nation? What have our politicians done for the country in the last 70 plus years subsequent to independence? What are your thoughts, Dr. Ekanayake? You've been watching all the developments that are taking place in Sri Lanka. You've worked in many companies, may it be state or may it be the private sector. Don't you think that we are in this mess today because of the politicians who have ruled us?
Yes, you see, we have had this culture of in Lee Kuan Yew's words, auctioning non-existent resources, right? The route to power has been thought to be distributing goodies to all the people around.
Subsidy.
And that's how the election, one time an election manifesto, at least in the public meetings, it was promised that people will be given rice even from the moon.
Cinema Bandaranaike style.
Yeah, so I didn't name, but that's the kind of, and the wordings have been different, but the trend has been right along that, and every successive government promises more, right? And that's how it has been
To
going.
come to power.
Now, if we look at 2019 when the new government was elected. Yes, they did this tax cuts, massive tax cut, right? But you look at the government before that in 2015, what did they do?
10,000 rupee.
As soon as they
Salary
came to
allowance.
power, they gave a massive salary increase, 10,000 rupees, and that has not been something which has been asked for, right? So you can't, everybody has been in this game. Came to a point when we built up a huge mountain of debt, and when the world saw it, they said, enough is enough, we are not going to give you anything, right? That's where we found ourselves to be. Now we got to get out of it, right? And how do we get out of it? To get out of it, we have to stop all the corruption, inefficiency, right? Try and recover what is stolen to the extent possible, right?
Dr.
And-
Ismail, sorry,
yeah.
on this stolen asset recovery, we know that under the Yapalnia regime also they sort of signed up to the stolen asset recovery initiative, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Valiamuna was sort of heading that up as a task force. Nothing was recovered. Now my question here is, because you were talking about inefficiencies and wastage, I can't think of many countries also where through STAR, where they've managed to get anything of substance.
The World Bank Star
Right?
program.
Yeah, so we know that even with the Airbus, that international, probably one of the biggest anti-corruption related international settlements that has been paid out by private companies, almost to the tune of $7 billion. Sri Lanka didn't get a cent from that, even though it has been established in those court documents that clearly there were officials at Sri Lankan Airlines who had taken bribes for...
That also came through
But-
their investigation,
Yeah,
not ours.
Not ours. We had also been investigating it for a long time, but by the time our investigators had managed to go and ask the questions, the court case was already finished. So my question is this now: the focus on asset recovery of assets that stashed overseas, will we end up just spending more money on whipping this dead horse?
No,
Because
no,
that
no.
money is not going to come back.
I have
'Cause
a
we
different view.
We have to pay the salaries of those lawyers, those
Yeah, but it's
investigators.
not a...
That's the taxpayers.
See, there are two things. When we have a legal framework enforceable, right? It is not only the recovery, but it's a deterrent. It's a massive deterrent for such activities. And that's a huge benefit. So that it won't, at least the chances of it happening at this magnitude will come down, and that's a benefit for the nation. So policing is another issue, but we are today in a different world where even in Sri Lanka, people are now willing to take on the government in the courts. In the recent times, we have seen the number of litigation, what are called public interest litigation, where individuals take up issues of great relevance and against the government and the authorities. So that's not something which is going to die down now. What we need is a legal framework, and people will begin to use it. Yes, it will take a while for the government to begin to use it. But what happens when the people start using them? These are so endemic, so widespread, you can't expect miracles overnight. You have to chip it away, bit by bit.
But
So-
let's take just by example. Let's look at through the STAR program. I think they were working out of the presidential secretariat. By the time they sort of launched the initiative here, we'd already heard of it's very interesting actually when you look at all of the offshore leaks. There have always been Sri Lankans featured in it, whether it's Swiss leaks, Paradise Papers, Panama Papers. There have always been some very prominent Sri Lankans. There have been the private bank in Switzerland, where former central bank governor used to be managing director at the time when apparently all these Sri Lankans had opened their accounts. So all that information was out there. We know that this team was working under the Yahapani administration for several years. Nothing.
Yeah, no, but there's a difference this time. I mean, just because it didn't work in the previous rounds, if it is a necessity, we can't give up. Right, Nadim? We got to do it because it's a good thing. It had not been done properly in the previous rounds, but this time it should be done. So at a minimum, now there's a timeline, very specific deliverable identified under this program for those acts to be taken up at the cabinet, to be passed in the parliament, and so on. So if we are left with, in the end, if we are at least left with the law, then we have the instrument
and the
work with
to prosecute people.
Yeah.
See, one other area is now people are accusing about IMF is we are taking more loans. But even the loans we have taken, we have to now put to good use. One example I see in today's papers is they are trying to shift the president's house, which may not be a priority today. What we should do is, what are the priorities? Where we can generate more income, as we mentioned earlier. Whereas, changing assets and building another presidential palace in Jawaharlal maybe not be the current priority of this country.
Talal, I want to, because we briefly touched on like the political economy of Sri Lanka, and like we see that even now, sort of as this conversation around privatization and restructuring has happened, we see like even now, like on social media platforms, you get prominent figures from the Aragal layer saying that the renationalization of everything that Ranil Wickremesinghe is going to privatize should be a major slogan at upcoming elections. So, given that Sri Lanka is in this kind of like weird state where the swings between governments are very extreme. It's going to be very difficult to, Mr. Fernando's job at the SOA restructuring unit is going to be all the more difficult because you're not going to attract investors, because people are not going to want to invest for, 2, 3, 4 years. They'll be thinking 10, maybe 20, maybe 30 years, right? How do we get around this?
So that is one of the biggest challenges of the IMF program, because it is a 4-year program, but then the targets are 10 years, up to 2032. So we are going to have 2 presidential elections, 2 general elections, and according to some polls, it shows that some parties who are not good friends of IMF may get larger representation in parliament. So this is what probably the NPP, I saw a few MPs of them speaking about it. And so that is why I say, of all the reforms, I would say that I've done a sort of a 1-hour speech on this, and even there I put like the first and most important reform is central bank independence. Because you see, we have had a primary budget surplus only 4 times in 75 years. I'm not even talking about fiscal deficit. Primary budget surplus. So that is minus the interest. We can't even balance that. That is how horrible our financial discipline is. So that is because of monetary financing and debt. So when you have a central bank, the monetary policy, which is controlled by fiscal policy, they just, printing money has been one thing. But if you ask me which reform should be prioritized more, so when it comes to the most important is CBS independence, but which should be, I should say, privatization, because that is something, because at a stroke of a pen, the Central Bank Act, everything can be brought out, but privatization is not easy to reverse.
So let me ask all 6 of you very quickly before we end the show tonight. What did you all think about the CPC protest today? How do you all view this in your eyes? Because now Sri Lanka seems to be somewhat out of the economic mess that we were in a year ago. the situation seems to be better. We see a glimmer of hope. There seems to be a silver lining, and there seems to be some light end of the tunnel. What is the message you have, all six of you, very briefly, I'll give you 2 minutes, to sum up your thoughts on a way forward for Sri Lanka? So I'll start off with Talal and then move to the other speakers.
So a message would be the reforms we are going through are brought in by the IMF. It's people are saying the IMF is imposing this, but if you read most of the whole document, I mean, most of these recommendations I myself have given in a talk a year ago, or Dr. W.A. Vijayawardena has given, or Nishant Dimel has said all this. So it's nothing new, it's just common sense. So this argument against the IMF, I always say, what is the alternative? There is no alternative. You're going to a surgeon, and you are being given the treatment, and the complaint is like the air conditioner is not working this much, or they didn't settle a fight between my neighbor over a wall. So those are not the I think we are going there because we have absolutely no other choice. So that is one message. Or the other thing is, I think that if we can wait this out and get the proper reforms, we can be a Thailand or an India. See, India has never gone back to the IMF for over 30 years. Because they did the right reforms. And even if you see
Since 1994.
Yes, 1991 by
91,
Dr.
Yes, yeah, Dr. Manmohan Singh.
Yes. So even India, which has reserves of $600 billion, I mean, it's doing very well and growing at 7%, but still they have a national consensus on privatizing.
So when you saw the protest today against the privatization of the CPC, what was going in your head?
So it is just how undemocratic is it that the workers get to decide on national assets. That asset belongs to everyone. It doesn't belong to the workers of the CPC or the CEB. So you know how I feel like I work for Deloitte. Like I can't decide what decisions are made. The owners of the company decide. So that is, it is one of the most undemocratic things that a trade union can hold a nation in ransom to get their demands done. That is undemocratic.
So I will take that as your final thoughts for tonight.
Yes.
You said, Talal, that you've been speaking about this a year ago. We've been speaking about this with individuals like Dr. Ekanayak and Dr. Dunu Singh and even Ravi for nearly 3 years, telling the government and giving them a red light that this is going to happen. I remember 4 years ago, we had Murtaza Jafarji on the show, and he said, we are in the ICU. And Dr. Vijayawardena said, we have to correct our course, if not, we are going to collapse. And that happened. So. Yeah. So on that note, let's move to Ravi Abhisuriya's thoughts.
My view is this is a pathetic attempt to safeguard their, I would say, territory or their power. But I think the masses, the public, is now so sick and tired of this statement politicians has been making that these are, you know, state assets or public property. I don't think people will ever buy this, and only a handful of, you know, these remnants of communism or socialism will buy that, because what has happened is the politicians, as we mentioned very clearly, have been using these state-owned enterprises to line their pockets and look after their interests when they come to power, to safeguard their own people who help them to come to power. So I don't see the public taking this, because I have seen very, very interesting comments of the public now taking this is the best thing that has happened to this country.
Very quickly.
These 3 oil companies, world's largest, coming in and taking over about 450 petrol sheds, and still we will be left with CPC few, I think about 200-300. I believe it will be sheer competition that will bring the cost even below.
Yeah, so when we go overseas, I've noticed, Ravi, several stations have several prices, not the same price. Certain petrol stations will have 350 rupees per litre of petrol. Some petrol stations would have 375 rupees. I've seen this even in Iraq, for that matter. So that will happen in Sri Lanka, and that will be beneficial for the people of the country.
Absolutely, because it is some people's perceptions about Shell being better quality. Now in Australia or in US, I see Shell is more expensive than other Chevron or something else. So that is what, you know, the public to decide. ultimately, if there is true competition, that will benefit the public, no other party. So what we want is regulation to ensure that they can't have monopoly pricing or getting together and conniving and pricing it.
Thank you very much, Ravi Abesuriya. I now move to Professor Priyanka Dhanasinghe. When we first had you on the show, Professor, you were Dr. Priyanka Dhanasinghe. Now you have fortunately received your professorship as well from the University of Colombo. So tell us, Professor, what's the way forward for Sri Lanka?
Definitely, I think as I mentioned earlier, these reforms agreed with the IMF, we must carry out. Resistance we need to expect, as in the case of CPC. Today, those who protest actually were basically the public were against them, and public basically came out very openly. And as a result of that, government was able to, suppress or basically take required measures to control it. But government must make sure that to do this, the privatization process must be done in an orderly manner with the required legal and regulatory mechanism. If not, what happens? Even it is possible even to take back. Okay, if public feel like we don't receive the expected service and the unexpected quality. Now we assume 3 companies are here, so we will have different qualities, and we have the automated systems and lot of restrooms also along with the petrol sets, and all these are expected things. We need to make sure at least some investment come in and some proper regulations are in place. Not just in the case of this petroleum import, distribution and storage, but in other areas as well. Through that way, we must make sure, we must get the support of the public. Public also, we need to keep that in mind. We say we say politicians are corrupt. Public also corrupt, people are also corrupt, that is why this corrupt system prevail here in Sri Lanka. So we need to make sure that in order to avoid corrupt practices, we place the required policies, and at the same time, now generally not only the public state-owned enterprises, even the public institutions, most of the time you could see that a lot of trade unions and all, they have basically turned those places into their own benefit rather than providing the required services to the public. That is
it's
the
all
nature
pretty
here.
Political agenda.
It's not political agenda as well.
Petty agenda.
I mean petty agendas of the workers. Simply, you take any government institution, they have make relevant arrangements in a way that basically make their life easy, make their work life easy, rather than providing the required services. As well, not just the state-owned enterprises, but also the other government institutions. We need to take relevant required reforms, right, to improve the productivity and efficiency.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Priyanka Dhanasinghe. Mr. Ranjit Fernando, former director of CEO NDB, as well as former chairman of Sri Lankan Airlines. What are your final thoughts?
Yeah. Issue of a government monopoly, breaking that monopoly is as important as privatization. Now in telecom, what we did was we opened the sector from that monopoly. That itself made SLT to perform well. That is the competition. In petroleum, it is a monopoly today. The CEB owns billions of rupees to Petroleum Corporation, and Petroleum Corporation is funded on all the LCs by the 2 state banks, and they are not honored. Recently, the People's Bank had virtually a problem with not honoring some banks' LC that was opened, and we just escaped that. Otherwise, the whole banking sector would have got into problems.
Yeah, blacklisted.
So I feel creating these kinds of competition. Now we brought in Indian oil here. What has happened? Nothing has happened. I mean, the people who cried against that, today we have a choice of going to another depot and getting the petrol. So they have their own tanks in Trinco. We have 99 tanks there, only 15 has been given to them. The other 90, other part we have to use, because when petrol is low in price in the international market, we should take and stock in those tanks so that we give a constant price to the consumer. So I feel that today what we are doing in these three companies coming in, they will fund their own purchases and bring. We had Shell and Caltex before in the country. There was nothing wrong with that. We privatized for political reasons, and we nationalized the whole thing for political gain. It was a philosophy rather than economic need. So I think this will save the government funding petroleum corporation and the two banks forced to fund them on the LCs. Right. This will open competition. They will bring their own petrol and sell to the public. So we don't have to fund that. The government doesn't have to fund that. So I feel it's totally ridiculous for people to protest against this. It is in their private interest and parochial interest that this happens. So I think we should, as a government, be strong enough to face this once and for all and say that we are on a different path now.
And take action for the best interest of the people. You know,
absolutely.
Public. Dr. Ganak.
Samir, what I can add to the conversation so far is that I feel that the government has to be more effective in addressing the people. The kind of arguments which were brought up here ought to be in very clear, simple terms communicated to the public at large and show them what are the benefits arising out of these actions, you know, restructuring, privatization, whatever. But at the same time, it is also necessary to address the specific interest groups and explain why it is necessary. Now, I am saying this with my own personal experience with the plantation privatization process. Remember, at that time, plantation sector had the largest single trade union in the country, and the leader was a cabinet minister. And leader was a cabinet minister who would be a cabinet minister in whichever government which is in power. Absolutely. Right? But we were able to have very open conversations with the plantation sector, plantation workers unions, staff unions, even the planters unions, over a period of time, very clearly explaining that the prevailing system was not sustainable. If that were to continue, they will all lose their jobs, perks and everything. Now this way, you can protect them. At least the large majority will protect. Now undue benefits we may not be able to continue. Like even when losses are being made, bonuses will be given. No, that sort of things can't be continued. No? And when there is no work, now recently we heard when the refinery didn't work for months and months, overtime has been paid. Now that's daylight robbery.
All that has to stop.
And that has to stop. And the general public ought to know the rip-offs which are taking place now, because it is the general public who pay for that, right? So I think all the very professional, design and implementation activities, while they go on, a properly designed campaign to address the stakeholders should take place. And I think it should take place not just one round, two round, it has to go on and on and on and on. And also, those who criticize ought to be pushed to a corner, basically saying, okay, tell us then
What is the option?
what is the option?
alternative?
What is a practical option?
Yeah.
Right? Tell us. Right? If you don't, now people talk about getting, for example, there's been hints that you can get all the money required from friendly countries. The countries have not been identified. We can only say is, look, China is a communist country, right? China did not come forward to write off all the debts. No, right? So some loose talk have to be confronted. It can be done in a nice way, but people should not be allowed to say, when we come to power, we know what to do, we won't do these things. What we have to ask them is, if you have the public interest, national interest in mind, it is not about your coming to power. Sharing your magic formula now itself so that we can adopt it. Right? Why do you want to come to power for that? Say what you're going to do and let's try it. So all what was talked necessary, but I think this communication part has to improve a lot. That will reduce the resistance and that will also generate a lot of support.
Thank you very much, Dr. Honorary Ekanaika, former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Ranjit Fernando, former director, CEO of NDB as well as Sri Lankan Airlines, Professor Priyanka Dunusingha, Mr. Ravi Abesurya, Advocacy Chair and Director, CFS Society Sri Lanka, as well as Talal Raf, Economist and Senior Global Management Consultant at Deloitte. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. When Talal, as I said before, we have been speaking about this over and over again with regard to government reforms. Dr. Ekanaika, Professor Dunusingha, Ravi, and now Ranjit and yourself, thank you very much for joining us again tonight, despite your demanding schedule and staying up until 12:05 in the morning to make our people cognizant about what is going on in the country. Thank you very much, Shania. Thank you very much, Nadeem, as always, for joining us this evening on the show. For the trade unions, lead, follow, or get out of the way. For those who are watching tonight, the best way to predict the future is to create it. Take care and good night.